there's all this talk about McCarthyism, and Dalton Trumbo, and he was the screenwriter. He wrote the movie Spartacus. I don't know if folks have seen the movie Spartacus, right? It's from the early '60s, in 1960 and '61, it's a movie, and it's based on a novel, and if the first time I watched Spartacus, I had just seen the movie Braveheart. I was a kid, and I had seen the movie Braveheart, like an edited version of it on television. Was very, very moved, very emotional film about martyrdom and sacrifice and rebellion. So I remember I saw the movie Spartacus, like the 1960 early movie, Kirk Douglas. I saw Spartacus, written by Dalton Trumbo. And I remember watching the movie Spartacus when I was young, when I was like, what, maybe, I don't know, I must have been like 11, maybe 12. I watched Spartacus. I hated it. I was just like, what is this? I didn't find it entertaining. I didn't get it. I thought it was weird. It lacked the emotions I liked. It was just, I didn't like Spartacus. Well, that's because I didn't understand it. And I watched Spartacus again, and then I read the novel that it's based on. And I realized that this is not about, the book Spartacus, the movie Spartacus, is not actually about ancient Rome. It's not about the slave leader in ancient Rome who led an uprising. That's not what it's about. It's actually a political allegory for the Second World War. Right? That's what the movie is really about. It's basically, so there's a slave revolt in the Roman Empire, and so Rome becomes a military dictatorship. Right? And at one point there's a scene where Crassus, the general who topples the Roman Republic, brings in the army. They have him with soldiers marching behind him, and he's supposed to look like Adolf Hitler. And it's supposed to be about the Roman Republic, which was, kind of sort of a democracy. You had people voting and such. The Roman Republic being abolished in the face of a slave revolt. And so then, the way that as the slave revolt is crushed, the way that Spartacus is able to flee, the way that his son is able to flee, is through an alliance with these Romans, these wealthy Romans, who don't like Crassus. So it's an analogy for the Popular Front, right? This is, the communists at that point, especially the novel, came out in the aftermath of the Second World War, right? We remember during the Second World War, according to, the common understanding of events, basically Germany, Italy had become fascist in response to the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union had existed. It was a socialist alternative to capitalism. So these capitalist countries were shedding the veneer of democracy and becoming fascist, right? In order to maintain the rule of capital. In fear of a communist revolution spreading, Germany becomes fascist, Italy becomes fascist, fascism is spreading, right? So then what did the communists do? They formed the Popular Front, or the People's Front, and they aligned with those anti-fascist capitalists to defeat the Nazis, right? And that's how, ultimately Eastern Europe moved into socialism, and that's eventually led to the Chinese Revolution. And so really what the Spartacus novel and the film was about, it wasn't really about ancient Rome. It was about, it was really, at the end of the day, it was about fascism, it was about the Popular Front, and it was about the Second World War, and that's what it was about. And I remember at the time reading William Z. Foster's book that he published in the early 1950s, The Twilight of World Capitalism. And the first chapter is all about World War II and what happened. And I'm reading this, and I'm like, aha. And so as you watch Kirk Douglas, you're watching an analysis of the Popular Front that happened during the Second World War, and and how fascism and the alliance against fascism by the communists took place. That's what you're watching. But the writer of the movie Spartacus was Dalton Trumbo. I don't know if folks remember Dalton Trumbo. They recently made a movie based on his life. There was actually a Broadway play with the letters that he wrote his family when he was in prison. Dalton Trumbo was a Communist Party member. He was an Italian-American, from New York City, eventually moved to California, became a screenwriter. He was a member of the Communist Party, and because he was a member of the Communist Party, he was blacklisted. And so, he wrote an award-winning movie, a movie for a very low-budget film company, and he wrote it under a fake name because he was blacklisted. It was called The Brave One. The Brave One. And he wrote this movie, and because it wasn't a very high-budget movie, and it was made in Mexico, very low-budget movie, but he wrote it, and he won the Oscar for Best Screenplay. But then he won the Oscar, and they announced that the Oscar goes to, and it was his fake name, And no one could go and claim his Oscar because, he was not allowed to write. He was blacklisted for being a member of the Communist Party. Very, very famous, occurrence that happened, Dalton Trumbo. And eventually, the early 60s, what was special about that was that McCarthyism had kind of run its course. 1946, you had the beginning of McCarthyism, with the Cold War, with the Iron Curtain speech by Winston Churchill. That was the beginning of McCarthyism. 48, you had the Communist Party of the United States basically being outlawed. The Smith Act trial, where the entire national board of the Communist Party is put on trial for teaching the necessity of the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. They're all put in prison. 1951, you have the McCarran Internal Security Act that's passed. The McCarran Internal Security Act, it says in a time of national emergency, the government is going to assemble a list of up to 2 million people who will be put in concentration camps, right? You can read about the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1951. Pretty crazy. Then, as things escalate, then you have, ultimately, 1954, you have the execution of the Rosenbergs in the aftermath of the death of Stalin. You have the entire international community basically rallying, to free the Rosenbergs, saying the Rosenbergs are innocent. All these heads of state around the world saying that this should not happen. But the Rosenbergs get the death penalty. Stalin is dead. Khrushchev is in terms of rising. And at that point, McCarthyism started to ebb. And the reason that it started to ebb was basically Joe McCarthy and the they weren't the John Birch Society yet. They weren't founded yet. But these kind of anti-communist fanatics, a lot of these doctors and lawyers and people like that, they were using the fear of communism to exercise political power in the United States. Right? Joe McCarthy famously accused the U.S. Army of not being hard enough on communism. Right, and had these investigations of the U.S. Army. And that all kinds of mainstream politicians were terrified of Joe McCarthy, and that this kind of extreme wing of the Republican Party that didn't represent the richest and most powerful capitalists. It represented kind of low-level, middle-class folks via Joe McCarthy. They were exercising huge amounts of political power, and everyone was terrified of them. And that was at the point where the Kennedy family, the Kennedys, they had been all about McCarthyism. They loved McCarthyism. They were Roman Catholics in the urban political machine of Boston, and they saw the Reds, the communist labor organizers and all that, as their rivals, as their competitors, as a threat. They were all about McCarthyism. But, mid-50s, they back away from it. And there was this fear among a lot of forces among the rich and powerful in the United States that McCarthyism was going to cause a blowback. That basically people were going to be so put off by McCarthyism that because of that, they're going to be interested in communism. And you actually start to see some of this play out. For example, have you ever watched the show The Twilight Zone? That was made during that period, the aftermath, when McCarthyism was kind of on its way out. And a lot of those episodes have themes about totalitarianism and how if you don't have free speech and if you suppress people for the way they talk, you're going to ultimately help the communists and the totalitarians. There's a movie, The Manchurian Candidate, which is like an anti-communist science fiction story. But in it, it's the Chinese have brainwashed this congressman, and he, when he went to Manchuria, and he's been brainwashed. But the way that when the Chinese, the communists have brainwashed this congressman, they make him an extreme right-winger. So it's like to discredit the United States, and it's like McCarthyism is hurting us in our fight against communism. That became a really big theme, and you had a whole crew of people, that were involved in the civil rights movement really took off. I mean, a lot of people, even up to the highest levels of the government, a lot of forces really felt that Jim Crow segregation was in a lot of ways discrediting the United States, because remember when Emmett Till was lynched, the Soviet Union took that photograph. They sent it all over the world, and they sent it to African countries, they sent it to South America, and they said, anyone who says the USA believes in democracy, look at this picture of this mutilated African-American teen who did nothing but allegedly whistle at a white woman, right? And that photograph, the photograph, it was really in Jet magazine, like an African-American magazine. The Soviet Union circulated it all over the world, and there were a lot of forces in the USA that felt like in order to fight communism, the USA needed to be more liberal. And that the more liberal the United States could be, that would be the way to defeat the communists. And so there was a surge of kind of liberal activism, and the Kennedy family gets involved with civil rights, and the Montgomery bus boycott, and all of this was happening, and McCarthyism was starting to play itself out. And the culmination of this kind of post-McCarthyism was the election of John F. Kennedy. And you'll remember that John F. Kennedy, at the time the movie Spartacus came out, at that point, that Dalton Trumbo, this communist writer, had written the movie. It was very open. He said, I'm Dalton Trumbo, I wrote Spartacus. And they were showing it in American theaters. And all over the country, the John Birch Society and these right-wing activist groups were picketing the movie. And you'll remember very famously, John F. Kennedy went to see the movie Spartacus. He went to see it. He said, you know what, it's a good movie. He gave an interview. He said it's a fine picture or something to that effect. And that was a big deal, and that was kind of McCarthyism being edged out. But, Dalton Trumbo is this writer, and I must say, as much as I now, as an adult, as someone who understands politics, and I get that the movie was about World War II, and it's a political message, and it's not Braveheart, now as an adult, I like the movie Spartacus. I must say, as much as I liked the movie Spartacus, and Kirk Douglas, and I love the politics there, Dalton Trumbo did another thing that disappointed me. He made another movie during that time period. He made the movie Exodus, which is just an Israeli propaganda film. I mean, it's just really explicitly, blatantly an Israeli propaganda film. Exodus, right? And there's that song, "This land is mine." It's Spartacus, right? Or not Spartacus, it's Exodus. I guess he must have liked movies that ended in US or OS. I'm just kidding. But no, but he made the movie Exodus, which was just an Israeli propaganda film. And the movie Exodus, interestingly though, as much as it was an Israeli propaganda film, let's not forget that the Communist Party of the United States, the Soviet Communist Party at that time, they were pro-Israel. They took pro-Israeli positions. It wasn't really until the 1967 war you saw that the Soviet Union, explicitly turn, against Israel. And there had been some falling outs. There was, the Doctor's Plot. There were various parts of Eastern Europe where they found Zionist spies, Israeli agents, or allegedly Israeli agents. I don't know the details. And there was tension. But ultimately, at the time the movie Exodus came out, there was no contradiction between being an open communist and a supporter of the Soviet Union and being a supporter of Israel. And so Dalton Trumbo, who made this great Hollywood, Marxist film, Spartacus, he also made a Marxist film, Exodus, that was very, very pro-Israel. So I can't fully endorse Dalton Trumbo there. But the other thing is, though, if you see his movie, The Brave One, it's the movie that he won the Oscar for best screenplay for. It's a really good movie. It's about a bullfight, and it's about this boy who goes to rescue his pet bull from a bullfight, and it's really low budget, made in Mexico, but it's got all kinds of politics in it, political hints, like below the surface. They talk about the peasant condition. They talk about the Mexican Revolution. They talk about Abraham Lincoln's alliance with the people in Mexico who wanted to fight for the peasantry, and how Lincoln had opposed the Mexican-American War. It's kind of below the surface. It's mainly like a children's movie about this little boy who's trying to rescue his pet bull. And it's also, it kind of hints at how bullfighting is about cruelty, and it's got a fascist edge to it, and why do people want to hurt other people, and it's kind of this human story about the little boy who wants to rescue his bull, but there's communist politics beneath the surface, in a way, hinting at it, but it's, Communist Party USA at the time politics, right? I mean, it talks about Lincoln in a positive light. Oh my God, right? You can't do that now, or else, it was the line of, that in Mexico there had been the Mexican Revolution, this uprising of the peasants, Los Indignados, and that was in line with Abraham Lincoln opposing slavery, and that there is this resistance of the people and this human resistance to cruelty. It's a beautiful film. I'm glad it won the best screenplay, because it's just a beautiful, beautiful film. Now, what's interesting about it is, the film, it's about bullfighting, basically, and it shows bullfighting in a very negative light. But it was pointed out to me by somebody that bullfighting, even though now, I'm opposed to bullfighting. Do not get me wrong. I am against bullfighting, cruelty to animals, barbaric behavior. I'm against it. But the origins of bullfighting, are interesting if you look at the origins of bullfighting. Bullfighting as a tradition actually goes back, I bet you didn't know this, to Mesopotamia. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Gilgamesh is this mythological hero considered the founder of Mesopotamia. And one of the actions of Gilgamesh is he killed a giant bull, right? Gilgamesh killed a giant bull all by himself. And it was to show the people that, look, this bull is bigger than I am. It's huge. The bull is huge. The bull is stronger than I am. The bull is bigger. But I, as a human being, possess human intelligence. So I, as a human, even though I'm weaker than the bull, even though I don't have huge horns, even though I'm not, 100,000 pounds, even though I'm nowhere near as powerful as a creature, I can slay a bull because I have a soul, because I possess within me human intelligence. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have this important scene where the founder of Mesopotamia, one of the first civilizations in human history, slays a bull to show his followers what it means to be human. And that the bullfighting ritual, and later, in ancient Rome, you have the Colosseums where they're killing animals, and that the bullfighting ritual originated in human beings trying to define what separated them from animals, and why it is we could build a civilization. Very, very fascinating. So as much as I hate bullfighting, as much as I'm opposed to it, cruelty to animals, as much as I'm opposed to it, it's fascinating that it has this history and humans trying to define themselves and define their difference and to lay the basis for civilization. And what's also interesting is it's kind of a double-edged sword because, the bullfighting is an act of cruelty. I mean, you're killing a creature there, but in the process you're defining, and so it's like civilization has always had an edge of cruelty.